Australia, now a prosperous and modern nation, has a past marked by dramatic changes. It is a land rich in history, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginal people, were the first to inhabit the continent, arriving over 65,000 years ago. They formed over 500 distinct tribes, each with its own language, culture, and territorial boundaries, thriving for millennia in harmony with the land. This peaceful existence was altered when European explorers began to venture across the globe during the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. The early European interest in Australia was sparked by theories about a large, undiscovered southern land, known as Terra Australis. The first documented European sighting occurred in 1606, when Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon landed on Australia's northern coast, marking the beginning of European involvement with the continent. Despite these early explorations, the Dutch did not pursue further colonization, instead focusing on their profitable spice trade in Southeast Asia. It wasn't until the 18th century, with the voyages of Captain James Cook, that serious European interest in Australia grew. In 1770, Cook charted the eastern coastline and claimed the land for Britain, naming it New South Wales. His report described the area's suitability for British settlement, a suggestion that would eventually lead to the establishment of the first penal colony. The decision to send convicts to Australia was partly driven by Britain's loss of its American colonies after the American Revolution. With the American option closed, Australia became the new destination for prisoners, marking the beginning of a dark chapter in the nation's history. The arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 marked the official beginning of British colonization in Australia. The fleet, consisting of 11 ships carrying over 1,400 people, including convicts, soldiers, and officials, landed at Botany Bay. Initially, they found the location unsuitable for settlement, prompting Captain Arthur Phillip, the fleet's commander, to sail further north and establish the colony at Sydney Cove. This marked the founding of what would become one of the most significant cities in the world today, Sydney. At first, the convicts, many of whom had committed minor crimes, were tasked with laboring to build the infrastructure of the new colony. The harsh conditions of the land, however, presented significant challenges. The British settlers struggled with the unfamiliar climate, diseases, and the hostile environment. Over time, the convicts who had completed their sentences were granted freedom, forming the foundation of a burgeoning free population. Alongside these freed convicts, more settlers arrived from Britain, some looking for opportunities to build new lives, and others seeking land to farm. Despite these efforts, the early years were fraught with difficulty. The relationship between the British settlers and the Aboriginal people was tense from the outset. The British settlers' disregard for Aboriginal land rights and cultural practices led to frequent conflicts, and the spread of diseases such as smallpox devastated the indigenous population. By the 1800s, the Aboriginal population had been decimated by disease and violence, a tragedy that would have lasting consequences. In response to the expanding settlement and the increasing tension with the Aboriginal people, the British authorities took steps to control the growing colony, appointing new governors like Lachlan Macquarie, who aimed to improve the colony's infrastructure. Macquarie's efforts laid the groundwork for a more stable society, but Australia's dark history of colonization continued to unfold. As the 19th century progressed, British settlement in Australia expanded beyond New South Wales, establishing new colonies across the continent. The growth was largely driven by a combination of free settlers and the continued transportation of convicts from Britain. Key settlements, such as Launceston and Hobart in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, the Swan River Colony in Western Australia, and Melbourne in Victoria, began to take shape. With each new colony, the British Empire solidified its control over the vast southern landmass. By the early 1800s, Australia had transformed from a remote penal colony into a thriving, albeit troubled, society. A growing number of Europeans arrived seeking opportunities for land ownership, which became one of the primary draws for settlers. This influx of settlers, however, came at a tremendous cost to the indigenous Aboriginal people, whose land was being steadily encroached upon. The British policy of terra nullius, the belief that the land was empty and unclaimed, ignored the Aboriginal people's deep connection to the land and led to numerous violent confrontations known as the Frontier Wars. At the same time, the Australian economy began to evolve. The discovery of valuable resources like wool transformed the economy, making agriculture one of the main economic pillars. However, it was the discovery of gold in the 1850s that triggered one of the most significant booms in Australian history. In 1851, Edward Hargreaves found gold in New South Wales, sparking a massive rush of fortune seekers from not only the Australian colonies, but also from Britain, China, and America. This influx of people swelled Australia's population and contributed to rapid urbanization, especially in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. The gold rush also fueled tensions between the miners and colonial authorities, particularly over taxes and the perceived injustice of local laws. The rebellion at the Eureka Stockade in 1854, though quickly suppressed, became a symbol of the fight for workers' rights and better governance, further strengthening Australia's burgeoning sense of national identity. By the late 19th century, Australia had undergone significant social, economic, and political changes. The rapid growth fueled by the gold rush, along with the increasing population of both free settlers and convicts, paved the way for the eventual shift from a collection of British colonies to a unified nation. The various colonies began to seek greater control over their own affairs, and the idea of a federated Australia gained momentum. The push for self-governance was driven not only by the desire for political autonomy, but also by a growing sense of Australian identity, distinct from its British colonial origins. The first steps toward federation were taken in the 1890s, and after years of negotiations, the Commonwealth of Australia was officially formed on January 1st, 1901. This marked a new era in Australian history, with the 6 separate colonies uniting under a single constitution. Sir Edmund Barton became the nation's first Prime Minister, and Australia began its journey as a fully independent nation, though still within the British Empire. The early 20th century was a time of both prosperity and challenge. Australia's involvement in World War I, particularly the Gallipoli Campaign in 1915, became a defining moment in the nation's psyche. The bravery of Australian soldiers who fought alongside New Zealand forces as part of the ANZACs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, solidified a sense of national pride and identity. The war, however, also brought significant loss, with over 60,000 Australians killed and many more wounded, a tragedy that would be commemorated each year on Anzac Day. In the decades that followed, Australia's role on the world stage grew. The interwar years saw economic depression, but also significant achievements in culture, sport, and aviation. Australia's post-World War II migration policies brought waves of immigrants from Europe, significantly diversifying the nation's population and economy. The dismantling of the White Australia policy in the 1970s further contributed to the nation's multicultural identity. By the late 20th century, Australia had emerged as a prosperous, modern, and multicultural nation. The Sydney Opera House opened in 1973, and the Sydney Olympics in 2000 showcased Australia's cultural achievements. However, the nation also began to face the reality of its colonial past, with increasing recognition and efforts toward reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. The history of Australia, once shaped by British colonization, had evolved into one of independence, multiculturalism, and a growing commitment to acknowledging past injustices. Today, Australia stands as a thriving nation that continues to balance its rich cultural heritage with the challenges of modernity, fostering a society that celebrates diversity and the enduring spirit of those who first settled its shores.